Welcome to the Hopkins Center. Take a moment to silence your cell phone. Also, please locate the nearest fire exit. Thank you.
Welcome to the fifth session of our six-session series, Our Divided Country, How to Find Common Ground. And I think you'll find today's speaker to have a lot of relevant experience in bringing people together. I want to remind you, as the recording just did, that please keep your cell phone turned off. If you have to exit during the lecture, use the back doors rather than the side. I want to take this opportunity to welcome our colleagues at the Osher Institute at the University of Vermont and the Osher Institute at Granite State College, both of whom are watching this in a live stream and will be submitting questions as well as you. And that reminds me that you've been given, of course, the file card to use to write questions and bring them up to the front where I and some others will be standing to submit them, because we then sort them and eventually those are used in the Q&A. I want to thank our many underwriters who make a huge difference in our ability to bring you this series. It's a very broad series, but one in which, and there's some expenses involved, as you'd expect. But these are the underwriters who've stood by us this entire series, many of them for a number of series before as well. There's the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Caldwell Law, Dartmouth Coach, Kendall at Hanover, Wells Fargo Advisors, and today's individual session is sponsored by Mascoma Bank. We should give them a thought. Now today, in the material you received, I hope you noticed, this total session has to end at 11 a.m. because our speaker has a speaking engagement in Portland, Maine later this afternoon. And so at 11 promptly, we will finish. We're only going to have a 20-minute intermission. That will give us plenty of time, that's what we're conscious of, to have a spirited and dynamic Q&A. So once we break, you'll have a 20-minute intermission. We'll come back here and immediately begin that Q&A, which will then end at 11 a.m. For today's speaker, the person who will be introducing him now is our co-chair of the summer lecture series, Pete Bleiler.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, the Honorable Senator George Mitchell. I'm going to tell you a couple of things about Senator Mitchell that you probably don't know. The first is that he and Bernard Osher have been friends for over 50 years. They're both from Maine. And when he sees Bernie, George calls him Barney, next month in San Francisco, he's going to tell him that he was here at Osher at Dartmouth this month. The second thing I want to mention is that when Senator Ed Muskie resigned from the Senate in 1980 in order to become Secretary of State, the governor of Maine asked George Mitchell if he would take Ed Muskie's seat. And George said that he had to talk it over with his family. And when he talked it over with his family, his two brothers said, "George isn't smart enough to be a senator." And that's when he decided to accept. He went on and ran for re-election in 1982 and garnered 61% of the vote. And again in 1988, and this time got 81% of the vote. We don't know how much he would have gotten if he had run again in 1994. As you probably know from the program booklet, he graduated from Bowdoin College in Maine in 1954 and received a law degree from Georgetown in 1961. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter appointed him the U.S. Attorney for Maine, and 2 years later appointed him as a U.S. District Judge in the U.S. District Court in Maine. In 1994, he declined the opportunity to be nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court because he wanted to continue his work on significant healthcare legislation. Unfortunately, that didn't come to pass. So in 1995, after leaving the Senate, President Bill Clinton appointed George Mitchell to be the U.S. Special Envoy to Northern Ireland. And this led to the Belfast Peace Agreement, or better known as the Good Friday Agreement, in 1998. As a result of his work, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Liberty Medal. He was also nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. In accepting the Liberty Award, Mitchell said, quote, "I believe there's no such thing as a conflict that can't be ended. They're created and sustained by human beings. They can be ended by human beings, no matter how ancient the conflict, no matter how hateful, no matter how hurtful. Peace can prevail," unquote. Please welcome Senator George Mitchell.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm reception. My thanks to John Ferries and Peter Blaler and all of the team at Osher at Dartmouth for inviting me to participate in this program. As Peter indicated, the Osher family is from Portland, Maine. They are an outstanding family of philanthropists, have contributed much to the community there, here, and California and around the country, so it's a special pleasure for me to participate in a program sponsored by Barney Osher. I thank Peter for that very generous introduction. I speak often, and so I must say to you, frankly, that for me, the highlight of the program is the introduction. It's nice to hear positive things said about you in any setting, but in front of a large group of strangers, obviously it's very nice. The risk to it, of course, is if you hear that stuff often enough, you may begin to believe it. So I like to begin with a story about introductions and an occasion on which I was brought back down to earth. As Peter indicated, I spent 5 years on the peace process in Northern Ireland. When it was completed and we got an agreement, I returned to my home in Maine and wrote a book about that experience. When the book was published, I went on a promotional tour around the country. I received many invitations. In the process, learned the interesting fact that in the United States, there are more Irish American organizations than there are Irish Americans. And every one of them invited me to come. I couldn't go to all, of course, but I did go to many, and as I traveled the country speaking to these Irish American groups, there developed among them an informal competition as to who could give the longest, most fantastic, frequently quite ridiculous introductions of me. In Chicago, a guy got up and he read for 35 minutes a long list of everything I'd ever done in my life. The interesting part was, to me, was that much of it I'd not been aware of until I heard him recite it. The proper reaction, of course, would have been for me to show some humility, to ask them, please, to keep it short. But I had an improper reaction. I loved it. I encouraged them. I scolded them when they left anything out. And as the tour continued, my head got bigger and bigger, so when I got to the last stop on the tour, the Stamford, Connecticut Irish American Society, I could barely squeeze my head through the front door. The first person I encountered was an elderly woman who rushed up to me, excited, nervous, shook my hand vigorously, almost bowled me over, spent several minutes praising me, and then she said, "I don't live anywhere near here." I drove 3.5 hours across the whole state of Connecticut just to come here and to thank you and to ask you, please, would you autograph my poster? So she handed me a poster with a big picture and a pen. I said, I'll be very happy to autograph your poster, but before I do, I think there's something I should tell you. She said, what is it? I said, I'm not Henry Kissinger. It was a big picture of Kissinger. She said, you're not? Well, who are you anyway? And when I told her, she said, well, that's just terrible. She said, I drove 3.5 hours to meet a great man like Kissinger, and all I've got is a nobody like you. I said, I'm sorry you feel so bad. I wish I could make you feel better. And she said, well, there's something you can do. And I said, what is it? She leaned forward, I leaned forward. We were in sort of a conspiratorial crouch. And she whispered, nobody will ever know the difference. And she said, would you mind signing Henry Kissinger's name to my poster? And I did. And it's hanging today in her living room wall in Eastern Connecticut, a daily reminder to me to enjoy, but don't take seriously, these kind words from people like Peter at the introductions. Now, Peter mentioned in his introduction how I got to the Senate and the reactions of my brothers. Let me tell you the full story. I was serving as a federal judge in Maine when Senator Muskie was appointed Secretary of State. There was a great deal of publicity, as you might expect, about who would succeed him. Several names were mentioned. My name was not, because I'd been appointed a federal judge just the year before. The governor announced, a great guy named Joe Brennan, announced early that he was going to have a press conference the following Monday, just a few days later, at noon at the state capitol, to announce his choice. And so on Sunday night, we in Maine, and we assume you in New Hampshire, go to bed early. And I went to bed early, wondering, like everyone else, what the governor was going to announce tomorrow. About 11 o'clock that night, the phone rang, and it was the governor calling. He said, I'd like you to come down to the state capitol at noon tomorrow so I can announce that I'm going to appoint you to the Senate. I said, gee, Governor, that's really a surprise. I said, it's quite a choice. I got to think about it. I got to call the members of my family. I have a large and close-knit family, so he said, I'll give you 1 hour. When I protested it was inaccurate, he said, that's all I can give you, because I've got to make the announcement at noon tomorrow, and if you won't take it, I've got to find someone else. So I hung up. I called my 3 older brothers. I grew up in Waterville, Maine, a small town in the central part of the state, and my 3 older brothers were very good and very famous athletes, particularly my brother Johnny, who in college made all New England, honorable mention All-American. And I came along, and I was not as good an athlete as my brothers. In fact, I was not as good as anybody else's brother. And so early in life, I became known around our small town as Johnny Mitchell's kid brother, the one who isn't any good. As you might expect, I developed a massive inferiority complex and a highly competitive attitude toward my brothers, which persisted throughout our lifetimes. So when I called them that Sunday evening, ostensibly to seek their advice, there was a note of triumphalism in my voice. I said, guys, the governor has just called me. He wants to appoint me to the Senate. What do you think about that? And the reaction was predictably very negative. My brother Johnny said, no one can understand how you get to be a federal judge. He said, you couldn't possibly win a statewide election, so you better stay where you are. My oldest brother, who fancies himself an intellectual, likes to use the Socratic method of making his point by questions. He said, first, let's ask the question. Aren't the people of Maine entitled to have a qualified person representing them in the Senate? He said, and second, he said, isn't it obvious that you are not among them? So after just a few minutes, I hung up the phone. I called the governor, and I said, Governor, I don't need the full hour. I've already received all the reassurance I need of my ability to perform this job. So that's how I got to the Senate, and I very much enjoyed my time there. I am going to now say some serious words about some of the issues confronting our country, and then, in accordance with your practices, be pleased to try to respond to your questions. Before I do, I should say that in my time in the Senate, I made many close friendships that lasted a lifetime. And one of my closest friends in the Senate was Warren Rudman, who represented this state for many years. Warren, as you know, was a Republican. I'm a Democrat, but we formed a close personal relationship, worked together on many, many issues, including serving on an International Commission on Violence in the Middle East, where we and a couple of other members traveled to the Middle East extensively, so I got to know him real well, and I speak in New Hampshire often, and I always like to mention the fact that a senator from New Hampshire was, to me, a great guy, although we didn't agree on many issues, and someone who we worked across the aisle with in a way that doesn't happen much anymore. So let me talk about some of our current issues. Fear of the future, complaining about the current state of affairs, are as old as civilization. Almost everyone here recalls the summer of 1968. The Vietnam War was raging. President Johnson withdrew. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. Riots tore through most major American cities. There are even a few of you here who may recall the Great Depression, when unemployment in the United States reached 24% and a frightened nation struggled to survive. Or you can go all the way back to 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. The word democracy is derived from two Greek words, demos, the people, kratzi, the rule of. Over centuries, the Greek city-states went through a slow transition from dictatorship to oligarchy to an early form of democracy. And democracy then was seen as a radical departure from past tradition and a danger to the whole society. And people wrote and made statements that are almost identical in language to many that you hear today about the decline of our civilization, about the loss of traditional values. But to them, the threat was the notion that all ordinary citizens should be able to participate in the choice of their government. Well, today, 2,500 years later, democracy still faces challenges, and the world is dangerous as it always has been. In the 20th century, an estimated 100 million people were killed in wars in a society and a world in which the population was about a third of what it is today. Each death in conflict is, of course, a personal tragedy. But today, the deaths are in the dozens and the scores. In the 20th century, they were often in the hundreds and the thousands. That could happen again if another world war erupts. But that's not likely in the foreseeable future, primarily because of the military dominance of the United States and its allies. But local and regional conflicts will continue with devastating impacts on those involved. In the coming decades, between now and the middle of this century, it will become increasingly clear that the long period of relative stability that followed the Second World War has come to an end. Across a wide swath of the globe, from South Asia to the Indian subcontinent, from the Middle East, and all across Africa, populations will grow rapidly in the coming decades. Human beings first appeared on Earth an estimated 300,000 years ago, but it was not until about 200 years ago that the world's population reached 1 billion. The most recent billion, the seventh, was added in 13 years. Although the rate of growth has slowed, the absolute numbers continue to rise rapidly. and much of the growth is taking place in countries already not able to meet the basic needs of their people, many struggling with widespread corruption, the absence of an effective rule of law. The political history of the Middle East offers some insight into recent and future problems around the globe. For more than 4 centuries, what we call the Middle East was ruled by the Ottoman Empire based in Turkey. When that empire collapsed in the aftermath of the First World War, Britain and France effectively divided up control of the region. Some of the political boundaries they created did not reflect the history or the interests of the people who actually live in the Middle East. That order lasted nearly a century, but has now collapsed under the weight of population growth, deep drought affecting many areas of Asia and Africa, mistrust, and widespread violence. And all of these factors are magnified by religious differences. Islam is now torn by internal conflicts, some of which overlap and intersect. Some date from the colonial and post-World War I period. Others go all the way back to the 7th century and the political competition to succeed the Prophet Muhammad, which led to the division between Sunni and Shia. That was not a religious difference. It was a political struggle for power between 2 competing groups, both of whom used religion to advance their interests. Pope Francis last year made a speech in which he discussed the phenomenon of religious differences being real and meaningful, but so often in history being used by ambitious men and women who sought power and exacerbated religious differences for the purposes of acquiring and retaining power. The division between Sunni and Shia has, over the past 1,400 years, been marked by alternating periods of remission and violent expansion. It is now intense and expanding. Saudi Arabia and Iran, the leaders of the 2 groups, are increasingly hostile. Conflicts in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen have inflamed the Sunni-Shia split with catastrophic consequences for the people of those countries. Radical extremists like ISIS have sought to impose a rigid form of Islam as they claim it was practiced during the life of the Prophet Muhammad. Thus the emphasis on beheadings, crucifixion, the acceptance of slavery, all of which were widespread throughout the world at the time within Islam and elsewhere. One result has been massive upheaval in the region and the greatest movement of people across national boundaries since the Second World War, and fairly soon at the current rate, it will exceed the numbers after the Second World War. As the flood of immigrants from the Middle East and Africa demonstrate, what most people want is what all people want: a stable and a secure society, a decent job, a home, and especially a chance to get their children off to a good start in life. The current upheaval is likely to continue for decades and will have inevitably uneven results. The consequences of the Arab Spring are disappointing, but there are some exceptions. In Tunisia, democracy has a fragile foothold. In Morocco, the royal family is charting a course for what they call democratization within monarchy. To those of us in the West who are impatient or some condescending to the slow pace of change in the Middle East, we should not forget that Europe was shaped by centuries of conflict. In France, more than a half-century elapsed from the time of the Revolution to what became the modern Republic. In England, hundreds of years. The Middle East is, always has been, and I think will be for a long time to come, very complex. And you can see that complexity more clearly from an American perspective by just considering the tangle of our relationships there. We oppose the Assad regime in Syria, but we also oppose ISIS, which is fighting the Assad regime. The Syrian Kurds join us in opposing ISIS, but the Kurds are being attacked by Turkey, which is one of our allies. We also combat ISIS in Iraq, where we are joined by Shia militias who are supported by Iran, who we oppose. In Afghanistan, we oppose the Taliban, but they receive support from Pakistan, with whom we are allied. And Pakistan, meanwhile, has fought several wars with India, another of our allies. We are allied closely with Israel, but we also are allied with many Arab and Muslim countries. For decades, we've had close relationships with Morocco, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and others. Of the 7.5 billion people on Earth today, nearly 1 in 4, about 1.8 billion, are Muslim. Sometime after mid-century, the total population of the world will be close to 10 billion, and about a third will be Muslim. To put that into perspective, 3 billion was the total world population as recently as 1960. So in the 21st century, what happens in the Muslim world will affect everyone in the world, in particular, the dominant world power, the United States. We have a clear and compelling interest in remaining involved in the Middle East and in doing all we can to help reduce violence and upheaval. But notwithstanding our efforts, inevitably there will be more years of disruption, and no single policy or single action can solve all of the region's problems. But after serving 2 tours of duty in the region, I believe that a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would be a significant step that might enable some of the countries, including Israel and Saudi Arabia, who already have private contacts, to cooperate in opposing their common foe, Iran and the Islamic terrorist organizations, those supported by and those opposed by Iran. I recognize that there is little reason at this moment to be optimistic about resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But my hope is that both Israelis and Palestinians, the people and their leaders, will weigh the risks of delay and inaction against what I believe to be the clear benefits of an agreement. And I believe it is important for the United States to try to encourage them to create the right incentives to help them enter into serious negotiations and to reach an agreement. Before he took office, the president said he had a plan for the region, and he has periodically stated he's going to announce it the following week. It has not been forthcoming, but I hope and pray that it will be, and that we all should pray for its success, because it will be an important step if we can move forward there. How the U.S. responds to this specific challenge, to the broader challenges of the Middle East, will have effects all over the world. In the 75 years before 1945, Europe was devastated by 3 major land wars, in the last 2 of which the United States decisively intervened. In World War II alone, an estimated 63 million people died. Led by the United States, the Western democracies helped Germany, Japan, and Italy to rebuild and become durable democracies, and created international institutions whose goal was peace, stability, prosperity. Institutions like the United Nations, NATO, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and crucially, the European Union. They sought to prevent a repeat of the past by promoting increased trade and collective security. And I believe history will judge that they have been largely successful. But in little more than a year in office, President Trump unwisely has announced the withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Accords on climate change. He also has withdrawn from the agreement with Iran on the nuclear program, withdrawn from the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, and ironically, with respect to Europe, President Obama initiated a negotiation to reach a trade agreement with the European Union. President Trump criticized President Obama for that effort, discontinued it, launched into a tariff war with the Europeans, and then just recently announced that the United States was going to talk to the Europeans about a trade agreement, essentially adopting the very policy that he had criticized and discarded a year and a half earlier. The effort to resolve trade disputes with China, Canada, and the European countries through tariffs rather than through the trade dispute mechanism of the World Trade Organization has been self-defeating for the United States. The President's recent trip to Europe was confusing, contentious, and counterproductive. And I respectfully but strongly disagree with the President in these policy areas. In particular, cooperative efforts with our historic allies are not harmful to American interests. To the contrary, the recent agreements and the post-World War II institutions have been highly beneficial to those who participated in them, including and especially the United States. Any American who thinks the world is unsafe now should contemplate a world in which there was no NATO, no European Union, no World Trade Organization, no United Nations. In that world, constant trade wars could, as in the past, lead to real wars, and the United States, as the dominant power, invariably would be called upon to lead alone. It is factually wrong and politically unwise to brand Canada as a threat to the security of the United States. And our ties with Europe predate the establishment of our country. We gained our independence from England by revolution, but we retained English language, laws, and customs. And after an early hostile relationship, our two countries over time formed what remains a special relationship. As our nation grew to settle a vast continent, we welcomed millions of immigrants from all around the world, and especially from Europe. And as a result, we have deep bonds of blood with Europe, not just legal relationships. While we compete in many ways, we should not think of our European allies as adversaries or, as the President branded them, foes. They also are our partners and our allies. Although they do not always agree with us, or even among themselves, for the most part, they admire our country and they share our values and our interests, in particular in democracy, free and open political institutions, and fair trade. Because it is in our interests and theirs, we should do all we can politically, economically, militarily if necessary, and otherwise, to help the people of Canada and Europe and our other allies to remain democratic, united, free, and prosperous. I cannot speak for others, but I have confidence in our country, our people, and our ability to meet these challenges. I believe that our democratic institutions remain strong and that, as in the past, science and reason will prevail over fear, divisiveness, and looking backward. I believe we must, we can, and we will devise policies to deal effectively with these and the many other challenges we will face in the coming decades. But to do so, we must foremost of all remain true to our principles. Our democratic ideals distinguished our country from the very beginning. They always have appealed to people around the world, and they still do. Our economic strength and our military power are necessary and crucially important. But American ideals have always been the primary basis of influence in the world. They're not easily summarized, but surely they include the sovereignty of the people, the primacy of individual liberty, our highest value, an independent judicial system, the rule of law applied equally to all citizens and crucially to the government itself, and opportunity for every member of society. Each of us, indeed every American, should never forget that the United States was a great nation long before we were a great military or economic power. We were a great nation because of the ideals contained in our founding document, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. We recognize that all human beings and all human institutions are imperfect. We acknowledge that we are not always right, and we can never be perfectly consistent, but we can and must work harder and better to live up to our principles as individual human beings and as citizens of our country. And finally, I believe we must especially work to more fully realize the aspiration of opportunity for every single member of our society. No one in America should be guaranteed success, but everyone, every single one, should have a fair chance to succeed. From the experience of our daily lives, we know that opportunity for everyone, equal opportunity for everyone, remains an aspiration. We must make it a reality. We must raise our actions to the level of our aspirations. Our goal should be to live in a society which encourages striving, celebrates success, is conducive to innovation, and enables us to benefit from the talent, energy, and skill of every single member of our society. That's our challenge, and we must work to make it our destiny. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. You go back and we'll go back. Okay, we will take a 22-minute intermission. Be back at 10 o'clock. And bring your questions down to the front, please. Welcome back. I hope this is on. Is it? Yes, it's on. The senator would like to start out with answering a question he got at the break about his brothers.
I didn't hear that one.
About your brothers.
Oh, yeah. Someone asked me about, they heard me tell the story about my brother Johnny recently. Could I retell it here? He passed away just a few weeks ago, and he said, I visited him shortly before then, and he said something he said before. He said, keep telling stories about me because people live on through their stories. And so I told this story at his eulogy. So it's a humorous story. I'm asked often, well, what was the highlight of your political life, or people think about the peace agreement in Northern Ireland or legislation that was enacted while I was Senate Majority Leader. But in fact, the highlight was the day after I was first elected in my own right to the Senate. I'd been way behind in the polls. I was an appointed senator, most of whom have had not very successful political careers. And I was at one time about 36 percentage points behind in the polls in the election, but I managed to win in an upset. And we had the traditional election night rally in a hotel ballroom in Portland. It was absolutely packed, and when the race was called, I was in a suite in the hotel, and I came down to give an acceptance speech. And not only was the hall packed, the stage was packed. You could hardly move. And my brother Johnny, who got a lot of publicity and who had a good eye for the camera and for reporters, he was standing right squarely at the podium with the microphones. He had elbowed my wife and daughter out of the way to get there. So when I got there, I kind of shared the podium with him, and he draped his arm around me as I delivered my thank you speech to the audience. So the next day, back then there were afternoon newspapers, and there was Portland Evening Express was the paper they had on the front page, a huge picture, and the caption said, Senator George Mitchell celebrating his upset election victory, being cheered on by an unidentified supporter. So, of course, I called up the paper and I said, I want a big, glossy. And I signed it, I had it framed, and I sent it to my brother Johnny. So the next time I visited, I looked around. I didn't see the picture anywhere. Second time I came, I looked around. Third time, no picture. I said to him, where's the picture? You should be hanging it. He said, it's upstairs, buried under 20 volumes of my scrapbooks. So go ahead, Peter.
Well, we've got several questions like this one. What's the secret of your success in the Northern Ireland negotiations?
We just celebrated in April of this year the 20th anniversary of the agreement. There were a number of events. Thank you. I attended and spoke at a number of events here in the United States and in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the United Kingdom. My conclusion, to summarize a long statement, is that the real heroes were the people and the political leaders of Northern Ireland. They had lived in conflict for so long. The public strongly supported the effort to get an agreement because they could not lead normal lives with this heavy overlay of violence hanging over everything, and uncertainty, random death and destruction, which adversely affected the economy, which adversely affected people's lives, which turned more and more people into violence in kind of a vicious downward cycle. And the political leaders. It's fashionable in democratic societies now to demean politicians, and Lord knows much of it is deserved. But there are moments in history when men and women rise to the occasion, and I believe that was one that deserves recognition and tribute. The members of the political parties, the leaders in Northern Ireland, there were then 10 political parties at the negotiations. They themselves had lived in conflict all their lives. Several of them had been shot. Most of them had been shot at. Some of them had committed violent crimes, which they were imprisoned for a while. But on this, they rose to the occasion at great risk to themselves, personally, their families. Some of their political careers ended the day they entered the agreement, but they did the right thing for their society. And I think they're the ones who really deserve the credit.
Here's a question from the Granite State contingent that says, with Brexit, what will a hard boundary between Ireland and Northern Ireland mean?
A hard boundary between Northern Ireland and Ireland would be disastrous for both Northern Ireland and the economy of Ireland. In December of last year, 7 or 8 months ago, the Prime Minister of the UK and the leader of the EU publicly announced that they were entering negotiations, and they promised that whatever the results of the negotiations, there would not be a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Now, what's happened is, once again, we see the realism that it's easy to make promises, it's hard to keep them. And they can't find a way to reach an agreement that vindicates that promise. The border before was a militarized border. There were armored carriers, troops, machine guns. They tried and did prevent travel back and forth across the border. It was a shocking thing for me when I first went there to meet people who lived within a few yards of the border who had never been across it. And what hard borders do is they create a climate in which demonization and stereotyping can flourish. So on both sides of the border, they had completely false impressions of the other because there was no exchange, there was no contact, there was no interaction. Now the border's opened as a result of the agreement. It's like driving from Maine to New Hampshire. You just drive across the border. And it has been remarkable in the effect it's had in personal terms, in economic terms. To give just one tiny example, which is replicated thousands of times, each year in Northern Ireland there are 6 billion liters of raw milk produced. Almost all of it shipped into the Republic of Ireland, where it is processed into cheese, yogurt, and others, then reshipped into the United Kingdom for retail sale and some into the European Union. You multiply an economy many times that way, and if you suddenly stop it, it'll have a tremendous adverse effect. And ironically, Brexit, while a democratically taken decision in a democratic society and therefore must be respected, will ultimately, in my judgment, have an adverse effect on the economy of the United Kingdom. But at least the people there voted for it, and they will suffer the consequences. But the principal harm will be in the Republic of Ireland, where there's strong support for the European Union, where they didn't vote on it and don't support it, but their economy is deeply integrated into that of the United Kingdom. And the UK is a big country, 65 million people, one of the biggest economies in the world. London is an economic powerhouse, England. Ireland is a country of 5 million people. And so you're going to have the perverse effect of negative consequences in many places, including people who never had a chance to vote on it and wouldn't vote for it if they could. So it's a huge challenge. I'm somewhat involved in it. I go there a lot, and I'm in contact with both sides. And my advice is for the leaders of the UK and the EU to stop negotiating through public comments and inflammatory statements and sit down in private and realistically make the concessions that are necessary to bring about the least possible harmful form of exit. And I think that is possible, and I hope that they do it.
What can we learn from the Northern Ireland peace accord to solve the problems and conflicts in our own country?
When I flew to Dublin in April to participate in the various events that I described earlier, celebrating the 20th anniversary, there were a few television crews at the airport when I got off the plane. And one of the questions was, well, isn't it terrible, all of this political dysfunction in Northern Ireland, where the government created, by the agreement, a power-sharing government between nationalists, who are predominantly Catholic, and unionists, predominantly Protestant, has been in suspension for over a year. And I was asked what I thought about that political dysfunction. I said, well, I just got off the plane from the United States. I said, and I don't feel particularly comfortable in lecturing anybody else about the consequences of political dysfunction.
Moving from Northern Ireland to the Middle East, please elaborate on why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is so difficult to resolve.
Yeah. I spent 5 years in Northern Ireland, and I thought it was, in fact, and I thought it was really difficult. And a couple of years ago, I spoke at a large Irish-American event in the borough of Queens in New York City, which is a large Irish population, and to a huge crowd, over 1,000 people, I said, I'm about to say something I never thought I would believe or say, and that is, after 5 years in Northern Ireland, I went to the Middle East, and after 5 months with the Israelis and the Palestinians, I now regard the Irish as a bunch of patsies, easy to deal with. It's a much more complicated situation. There are many more external factors implicating it. It is a huge mistake to think of and to analyze the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in isolation from the region in which the countries exist. A region now in severe tumult and upheaval, which affects the thinking of both Israelis and Palestinians, and conversely, what happens among them interacts and affects the events in other countries. So it's much, much more complicated. Many more external factors that impact upon the thinking of the political leaders. But in the end, I will tell you what I said directly to Prime Minister Netanyahu on several occasions, and what I said directly to first Chairman Arafat and then to President Abbas, the leaders of the Palestinians. I said to the Prime Minister, Israel is in a strong position. It is the dominant military power and is overwhelmingly dominant in every aspect to the Palestinians. And the time to make an agreement is when you are in a dominant position. The Prime Minister expressed concern that look at what's happening in the region, and how do we know that if we create a Palestinian state right close to the heart of Israel, and these are very small, compact areas in comparison to the type of geography that we Americans think about. At one point, Israel is 9 miles wide. That we'll have a failed Palestinian state, that the Palestinian Authority, which is pledged to nonviolence, which recognizes Israel, which has accepted all prior agreements, and has aggressively and successfully deterred Palestinian, Hamas primarily, Palestinian violent action against Israel. That's the big difference between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, the use of violence or not. My answer to the Prime Minister was, the likelihood of the Palestinian Authority collapsing and Hamas taking over is much greater in the absence of an agreement than if an agreement occurs. Increasingly among Palestinians, President Abbas and the Palestinian Authority are viewed as enforcers of the Israeli occupation, as opposed to seeking to resist the occupation. And so that support is declining, and Hamas support is rising in the West Bank. And so I said to the Prime Minister, each course of action has risks, but the longer you go this way, the more likely it is that the Palestinian Authority will collapse. And I begged the Prime Minister, I begged him. You will recall, many of you, that a few years ago, Hamas launched a military raid in Israel and captured an Israeli soldier. They killed 2 and captured 1, a corporal named Shalit. It became a huge international issue, and in Israel, a highly emotional issue, to get Shalit back. And the Israelis negotiated with Hamas through intermediaries and secured his release in an agreement in which they gave up 1,000 Palestinian prisoners to get Corporal Shalit back. And I begged the Prime Minister, give some prisoners to President Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. They don't commit violent acts against you. They're pledged to nonviolence. They're your potential partners, because if you just give prisoners to Hamas, the message you send is that violence works. They conducted a military raid, they killed 2 Israeli soldiers, and they captured 1. And they got 1,000 prisoners released. Well, he refused. It's the wrong message to be sending. The message to be sending is that violence doesn't work, and that peaceful negotiation does. Now, what I said to Arafat and to Abbas is, you've been, in late 1947, the United Nations proposed a petition, the creation of a Palestinian state, the creation of an Israeli state, and Jerusalem as an international city. After a bitter internal debate, Israel accepted. The Arabs rejected it. 6 Arab countries invaded Israel because they thought that they could easily defeat them. There were only 600,000 Jews living in Israel then, and 6 Arab countries surrounding. Prime Minister Ben-Gurion is a great man and short, stocky. He was very confident, and a reporter said to him, "How can you be so confident? We have 6 countries with huge armies surrounding us." He said, "We have a secret weapon." The reporter said, "What is it?" He said, "The Arabs." They didn't cooperate, they didn't coordinate, they divided up the spoils before the war began, and as a result there were no spoils. And so I said to Arafat and to Abbas, every rational person in the world would now accept what the Arabs rejected in 1948, but it's no longer available. Time, circumstance, and the consequences of wars have changed it. But I said to them, the offers are declining in value to you over time. So get into negotiations, make the best deal you can. It won't be 100%, may not even be 80%, but you can create a state and you can build on it. The Palestinians are talented people. They have great strengths, and build on it. But to keep waiting and this excuse and that excuse, and their situation is declining over time. And I said the same thing to Abbas. Some magic formula is not coming down from heaven. It's got to be negotiated. You've got to sit with the Israeli Prime Minister, and you've got to make some concessions on both sides. So far, neither has been willing to do it, and here's the reason, and I'll conclude. I'm sorry for the length of this answer. But both societies are divided. The Palestinians, Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority vie for control. And Israel, support for a 2-state solution continues to decline. It's now just over 50%, once was much higher. And the right wing in Israel is gaining strength and support. And within the current government, the coalition government, there are many prominent ministers who publicly oppose there ever being a Palestinian state on the West Bank. They want all of the land for Israel, and they claim it's given to them by God. So for a prime minister to enter into a negotiation, knowing that the first hint of concession, he'll get attacked at home, He has to believe there's some chance of success. And the same thing for the Palestinian president. They both don't think the process will succeed because they know each other so well. Netanyahu believes, now this is speculation on my part, Netanyahu believes that Abbas does not have the political or personal strength to enter into an agreement and never will. And therefore, why should he risk criticism and maybe losing office from his right wing to make concessions? Abbas believes that Netanyahu is not serious. He doesn't believe a word Netanyahu says, and he thinks that there'll never be a success as long as Netanyahu is prime minister. And he cites the fact that Netanyahu in his career has been against a Palestinian state, for a Palestinian state, against a Palestinian state, for a Palestinian state, now says he's for it, but not now. So he's been on both sides of the issue for a long time, and the Palestinians simply don't believe a word he says. So you get both leaders unwilling to enter into a negotiation because they feel they will have to make concessions that will bring them harsh criticism, possibly removed from office, possibly in the case of Abbas, personal threat, and it won't work because of the other guy. So maybe it'll take new leaders and a conviction that we have to do what's right for the country as opposed to, by staying in office.
One person wrote that he or she lived in the Middle East for many years, and they found that no one wants U.S. intervention of any kind. Given that, how can you justify U.S. intervention in the Middle East?
Well, I disagree with the premise of the question that no one wants U.S. intervention of any kind. The fact is they all want U.S. participation and innovation privately, although publicly some say the opposite. And I don't want to shock anybody but it's not unusual that governments say one thing publicly and another thing privately. Yet what they want is an American policy that's consistent with their interests. I met with the leaders of every country in the region, including the Israelis and Palestinians, many, many times, and many leaders in Europe and Eastern Europe as well. And they all get around to discussing American policy, and they all got some criticism. So I always ask them, well, what would you like American policy to be? If you were the president, what's the policy you'd implement? And I don't want to shock anybody at this. 100% of the answers are policies that favor them. And usually, they don't only want you to favor them, they want you to denounce their opposition. So what they say, we don't want Americans involved, is simply not the case. They want Americans involved in their behalf.
Here's another question from the Granite State. Since there is no constitutional mandate requiring America to be a leader in the community of nations, why should America continue to police, protect, and proselytize democracy to other nations? And so often their activities siphon off attention and resources away from pressing domestic issues.
I respectfully but strongly disagree with the premise of the question. I think it is very much in American interest that we play a role in international affairs in both a political and a practical sense. If there's any lesson we should have learned from 9/11, is that if we don't deal with issues around the world, they will come here to deal with us. And to think that you can somehow simply ignore everything that's going on in the rest of the world because it's burdensome on us to deal with these issues, I think is a profound fallacy. Demonstrably so in the case of 9/11, and I think there are many others. Secondly, the fact is that we have benefited enormously from the post-World War II structure that developed in terms of international institutions and trade and alliances. As the dominant power, we would be called upon repeatedly to intervene in any conflict in the world. And without a United Nations, without NATO, without alliances, we'd be doing it alone. In fact, we're doing it with the help of many others of our allies. When I first went to Ireland, this is 20 years ago, but it was striking even then, an Irish official shocked me by saying that Ireland, with a population then of 4 million people, had more Irish peacekeepers on duty around the world than Americans had. More of their citizens were trying to keep the peace in the Middle East and Africa and other places, and it helps us. The fact that the dollar is the world's reserve currency produces enormous economic benefit to the United States. Of course, there are some costs and disadvantages to it, but any realistic weighing in the balance suggests that it tilts strongly in our favor. I mean, people might not like this example. Just think about the billions of dollars we get from arms sales around the world. That's a controversial example, but it's the case. Just think of the billions of dollars we receive from just the opposite, non-harmful, dominating the world in entertainment. American movies, American television, the American culture, for better or for worse, is spreading around the world. The English language is now taught everywhere in the world because of American dominance. So while we did live through a period in our history of isolation, which made sense at the time, that ended in the ending of the First World War. And we can either choose to participate in world affairs on terms favorable to us and to others, or we can retreat in what I think would be a misguided and unsuccessful attempt to isolate ourselves from those world, to build walls and to not enter into trade agreements, to not enter into other forms of alliances. To me, it's clear. I personally think that the result is so strongly ordained in favor of our continued leadership and involvement, not least of which is what I mentioned in my remarks. It's our values that matter, and our values infuse people with hope and expectation, and despite what they say in public, they understand that, they want that for themselves, and I think we should continue.
How can we restore credibility and trust in the U.S. Supreme Court?
Every president who has had the opportunity to make appointments to the court sought to advance the interests and values that he deemed good for the country. And I'm a Democrat, a former judge, and I regret the current direction and tenor of the court, but I accept that it's a product of our democratic system, and that I express the hope that people will come to realize that as they vote, that vote in presidential elections is more than just the person being elected, but will have consequences on the legal and judicial system for years to come. And I think it's plainly now going to continue to be a conservative-dominated court with some decisions that I think are harmful to the nation's interests. And I agree with many of the court's decisions in recent years, but I disagree strongly with several of them, and I think several of them have proven to be quite harmful. I'll take just one example, well known, and it affects the political process, and that's the decision by the court in a series of related cases, including the most prominent one, Citizens United, to essentially open the floodgates to spending in our campaign. If there's one thing Americans don't need, it's more money going into the political process. And the court didn't. The court didn't create the problem. Money and organization have been factors in political leadership from the dawn of civilization, but it greatly exacerbated it at precisely the time when a series of related actions, not by the court, but in our society, have dramatically reduced transparency. So in the elections of 2018 and 2020, billions of dollars will go into the political process, and there's not a person here or a person in the country who will know for sure where it came from, who gave what to who. 2 years ago, in the spring of 2016, 60 Minutes ran a segment on campaign funding. I urge you to look it up. I'd never heard of him. Never met him, don't know who he is. A Republican congressman from Tampa, Florida, came on the air, and he described the process of orientation that he received when he entered the House of Representatives. And to be fair, both sides do the same thing. And it was all about money. He was given a card, which he exhibited, showing how he should divide the hours of his workday. 4.5 hours making phone calls to raise money, 1 hour on legislation, 1 hour on dealing with constituents. It was difficult when I was there. I was a majority leader. Very difficult. Every morning I came to work early, 7 o'clock, 7:30, I had a stack of calls that deep on my desk. Please don't have a vote at noon because I got a fundraiser. Please don't have a vote at 4, at 5, at 6, at 9, at 10 because I have a fundraiser. And democracy has been corrupted, not in the publicly expected way of Senator Peter, if you'll cast a vote, I'll give you a sack full of cash. It's much more subtle than that. I'll illustrate it here. I'm going to ask you a question I ask American audiences all over the country. How many here believe that the members of Congress are more responsive to their constituents than to their donors? That's 10 years I've been asking that question. I didn't get a single hand raised until a couple of years ago. I was in the suburbs of Washington. I asked the question. One woman raised her hand. I didn't want to embarrass her. I waited till the event was over. I went up to her. I said, I didn't want to ask in front of the crowd, but I got to ask you. You're the only person in America who's ever raised her hand. What's the answer? She said, it's very simple. My husband's a member of Congress. And the bond of trust, in a democracy, the bond of trust between the public and the elected officials is essential to the effective functioning of democracy. And that bond's been severed. It's very clear here. This audience, just like every other one, business groups, student groups, money dominates the system. And the court, unwisely, in one of the most poorly written, poorly reasoned legal opinions you could imagine. I challenge anyone here to read it. Try to read the opinion in Citizens United, citing things that are obviously untrue, made it much worse. We've got to figure out a way to get a decision that says, yes, we can constitutionally limit the amount of money that goes into political campaigns. We can limit the amount of money that's spent in political campaigns, and we can require full and complete disclosure. That's essential, I believe, to the continuation of our democratic society.
Changing the subject abruptly again, the Iran nuclear deal. What are the parts of it that you would defend, and what do you believe the main reasons for the Trump administration's rejection of it?
Well, I think the main reason is pretty obvious. If Obama was for it, Trump is against it. The decision to withdraw is illogical and I believe unwise. You mentioned the Middle East. Let me begin by framing the debate. In the United States, as we debated the Iran issue, on television and in the news, 3 opinions were largely presented. That of the Obama administration supporting the agreement, that largely Republican opposition to it, focused now on President Trump, and the third was Prime Minister Netanyahu representing Israel, who addressed a joint session of Congress in opposition to President Obama's policy. So the impression was created among Americans that there's two sides in America, but only one side in Israel. In fact, a very large number of Israeli defense, security, and intelligence officials, current and present, have publicly supported the agreement and denounced the position of the Prime Minister as contrary to the security interests of Israel. I wrote an op-ed article for the Boston Globe on that subject, and the only problem I had was there were so many of them, I had to cut off the list because the Globe has a limit on how much you can put in. So the fact is, you got to dispense with the view that all of Israel is united in opposition to the agreement. It's very, very strong opposition, other than the Prime Minister and his party, to the withdrawal from that agreement. It's very, very dangerous to Israel's security. Secondly, the President is now reimposing sanctions, which will have an effect. American dominance in the world is so strong, especially in the area of finance, which is increasingly internationally linked, and you can hardly enter into a financial transaction anywhere in the world that does not reach into the American, or is not reached by the American financial system. It will have some effect. But the history of sanctions is very clear. When they are universal, they largely are successful. When they are unilateral, they largely are much less successful. And it's a mistake to think of this as an agreement between the United States and Iran. It's an agreement between the United States, China, Russia, Britain, France, and Germany on one side, and on Iran. And all of those countries have publicly said, even before the decision to withdraw was taken, that they want to continue the agreement, on which international inspectors accepted by the United States intelligence community have verified that Iran is in full compliance. Iran reduced its stockpile of uranium by 98%. It reduced its operating centrifuges by 2/3. There is no doubt that they are not now continuing any effort they may have had before toward a nuclear weapon. The President has rejected that as inadequate. And yet, after a single meeting with the leader of North Korea, in which no agreement was reached, the President said, the problem is over. Now, those are completely contradictory approaches to the same problem. The challenge isn't over anywhere. It is among the most serious of issues that we face. I want to add a comment. During the campaign, President Trump said several times, it might be a good thing, those were his words, if Japan, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia achieved nuclear weapons, so we wouldn't have to pay to defend them. That's one of, and that statement has never been withdrawn or rescinded or contradicted. That's one of the most dangerous statements any American president could make. We led the world into the nuclear age, and we have led the effort to restrain their dissemination with considerable success. Dozens of countries in the world have the capacity to produce nuclear weapons, but they voluntarily refrain from doing so in reliance upon the United States and upon the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which the United States led in the creation of. And so, if Saudi Arabia, Japan, and South Korea get nuclear weapons, or if Iran and North Korea get nuclear weapons, the likelihood of others making that decision will increase dramatically. It took 75 years to go from 1 to 9. In a decade or two, we could go from 9 to 19 or 23. And the world will be much dangerous then, not just in the possibility of conflict between nation states, but even more so in the possibility of a terrorist group gaining access to nuclear materials. Now think about it. The single factor which many ascribe to the lack of use of nuclear weapons between nation states is deterrence. If you use a bomb first, I'm going to destroy your country in retaliation. Countries have defined boundaries and defined populations. Terrorist groups do not. So the most important restraint on the use of weapons exists for countries, but not for terrorist groups. If ISIS or Al-Qaeda or some other group obtained material and set off a dirty bomb in Chicago, where would we drop the retaliatory bomb? Think of the consequences of this for the future of our country. It's a very, very dangerous thing. And the president's actions, both with respect to Iran and North Korea, and his statements are deeply, deeply unsettling in this regard.
A few years ago, you and 3 other former Senate Majority Leaders, Bob Dole, Howard Baker, and Tom Daschle, formed the Bipartisan Policy Center with the idea of gaining bipartisan support for legislation. How is that going, and what is going on with the increasing polarization?
Yeah. We sought to create a forum in which there could be discussion across party boundaries openly and freely to produce policy statements on issues that could have an effect. And so far, I think it's had mixed results. There haven't been many changes in legislation, but the Bipartisan Policy Center has become a useful resource for members of Congress on both sides, and we have affiliations with members from both sides in trying to establish at least a common factual framework from which to devise policies. I myself chaired a lengthy process, about 18 months, on housing policy. We issued a report which has been widely cited and used, although candidly many of the recommendations some of the recommendations were accepted, many were not. So, and it's a forum that people can use for that purpose, and we continue. Senator Baker has passed away. Senator Dole is now in poor health, but he's still, I talk with him quite regularly, we're good friends. He's still somewhat active in the activities of the Bipartisan Policy Center, and it hasn't done as much as we had hoped, but we continue in the effort that we believe is necessary in our country, and that is to have more discussion and hopefully more results that are bipartisan in nature, that people of goodwill in both parties can ascribe to. And I think the more difficult the times get, the more important such efforts are.
Would you comment a bit about China and Russia and what our relationships with each of those countries should be?
Right. The United States is the dominant world power and will, in my judgment, be for as far into the future as human beings can see. Looking at the audience and seeing the ages involved, I don't think anyone here is going to see a situation where the United States is not the dominant world power. Democracy, among its benefits, is self-criticism, constant self-analysis, and we exercise that very vigorously in our country. But if you look at it objectively, I think there's no prospect of our decline in the foreseeable future. China is a great nation, a long, storied history, tremendously energetic people, education-oriented, all very entrepreneurial. I don't think you can find a single committed communist anywhere in China. The leadership uses it to stay in power, but they're very entrepreneurial. But we tend to exaggerate our problems and minimize theirs. First off, China has 4 times as many people as the United States, and their economy is half our size. The American economy is now about 20 trillion, China's about 11 trillion. Secondly, they are just now entering a stage where they're encountering many of the social problems that the Western democracies have already faced. Stagnant population and a dramatic extension of life, and therefore a steep reduction in the ratio of workers to retirees. Their population is now just under 1.4 billion. That's where it will be 50 years from now. Meanwhile, it's a much older population, and they're going through the same cycle of industrial development growth that the more advanced economies have. They are abusing the privileges of entry into the world trading process under the World Trade Agreement. They came in as a developed country. They insist on retaining that status. They impose restrictions on many imports into their country that they don't want imposed on their shipments. President Trump is quite correct in wanting to deal with that problem. I believe he's taken the wrong remedy. I mean, what he's doing is sort of like after Pearl Harbor if we invaded Brazil. It's, the solution isn't dealing with the problem. We should be addressing the problem. For example, where they impose restrictions on financial institutions, American entering their country, we should impose directly related on theirs, all across the board. The notion of indiscriminate tariffs like we're doing is just exactly the wrong approach, and it undermines the whole World Trade Agreement because it doesn't utilize the trade dispute mechanisms that they have there. So I think his analysis of that aspect of the problem is correct. I just think the solution is the wrong one. So there's no reason why conflict between the United States and China is inevitable. Competition, yes, but I think we can manage it with some degree of self-confidence that we will retain. I think he did the Chinese government, the communist government, the biggest favor any American president has given in the last 50 years by withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. 11 Pacific-facing nations, all of them not wanting their primary economic relationship to be with China, sought an agreement with the U.S. And the president rejected it. So now they are doing what they have to do, which they don't want to do, is they're establishing their primary economic relationships with China. It's a gift that won't stop giving for the next half century. Russia is another story. How many people here realize that the Russian economy is less than half the size of the economy of California? Less than half of California's economy. It's about the size, smaller than Canada. It's about the size of Spain. And they have problems. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the current state of Russia was established, they had over 150 million people. Now they have less than 140 million people, and they are one of the few nations that are declining steeply. Only Japan's population is declining more steeply. Their economy is based largely on taxes on oil and gas. To be in balance, their federal government budget requires oil and gas internationally to be priced at $110 a barrel. It hasn't been anywhere near that for years. There's no prospect of it getting there anytime soon, so they are running enormous deficits, burning through reserves at a rapid rate. More alarmingly, although their population overall is declining because the majority Slavs have a very low birth rate and a very high death rate, the population of Muslims is increasing dramatically. Now 12% of the population, in just a couple of decades, will be 20% of the population. And when Putin entered Syria militarily, he said the reason they're going in is because there are so many Russians, Muslims, fighting on the side of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. He said, we want to take them on there rather than wait until they come back here. And all along their southern flank, they have terrific problems in that regard. Putin is all for a referendum in Crimea, but he will never permit a referendum in Chechnya and the other Muslim parts of Russia. So they're having very difficult problems. They do have nuclear weapons. They do have a closed political system in which a single person makes all of the decisions. And that creates the aura of strength, which President Trump so much admires. But history's demonstrated so clearly that while democracy is messy, democracy is difficult, democracy is complicated with opposition parties and a vigorous press, the huge Achilles heel of dictatorships is the absence of such factors and the capacity of single humans to make catastrophic errors. And I think it's very clear we're not going to change our system, and they're in a very difficult time and considerable decline. That for 3 years, their economy contracted. It may have leveled off now. While our economy is booming, their population is going down, ours is going up. How many of you realize that in 2050, just 32 years from now, the number of Americans will grow from the current 325 million to 440 million? And our size grows, our economy grows, our strength and power grows, our influence has declined, in part because of some of the actions that we've talked about, but I think that's a temporary circumstance.
Last year, one of our speakers was William Perry, and he talked about nuclear proliferation. And I think when you were in the Senate was when he was working with North Korea for denuclearization. And what happened to derail that?
Well, there were several factors, the principal one being that the North Korean government simply didn't do what it agreed to do. My experience in conflict resolutions is that getting an agreement is the easy part. Getting implementation of agreements is the hard part. Anybody can say, yeah, okay, I'll do that. In fact, my kids say that all the time. But then getting it done is the hard part. I think that there may have been some miscalculations on our side, but I don't think they were in bad faith. And we tried, and they didn't keep their word. And what I fear now is, I mean, it's simply incredible that the president would have a single meeting and then pronounce that the issue's dealt with, when it so obviously is not dealt with, and we have to try, and I hope they're trying, to nail it down and to bring them around. I think it's unlikely that they're going to do what we would like them to do. The question is, how much can we get them to move in the direction of limitation or control that can be satisfactory from our standpoint. This is of enormous interest, of course, to us, but in particular to the South Koreans and the Japanese. It's an enormous issue in that in the whole Pacific region.
In my introduction of Senator Mitchell this morning, I failed to mention that he's also on the board of directors of the Boston Red Sox. And this question is whether or not the Boston Red Sox will fold in the playoffs.
Oh, boy, you're sounding like fake news now. Well, of course, one never knows about the playoffs. The last time the Red Sox won 100 games was in 1946, when they lost in the World Series to St. Louis 4-3. So you never know. You play 162 games to get into the playoffs, and you can be out very quickly. But it's been a privilege for me to be associated with the current ownership since they acquired the Red Sox. I was part of the team that I'm a lawyer, so I was retained to help them, and I've done so since then. And it's quite an exciting season. I think they've got a great team. I think they're very likely to win the American League East Division, but you know, you get into a 5-game playoff or a 7-game playoff, someone gets hot, someone doesn't do well. I don't want to sound defensive. We've won 3 World Series in the 21st century, I think the only team that have done so. And so we're very hopeful pleased at how it's going and confident as we can be under the circumstances of the baseball playoff system.
Sure. We only have a couple minutes left, but maybe you could just continue talking about Major League Baseball and briefly about your working with them on the enhanced steroid problem.
I've done a couple of studies for baseball. I did a study with Paul Volcker and George Will and a fellow named Rick Levin, who was then the president of Yale University, on the economic structure of baseball in the early 2000s. And we made a series of recommendations that were accepted and, I'm proud to say, have resulted in no work stoppage since then, as opposed to several work stoppages in the years before then. The recommendations became the basis of the collective bargaining agreement between the league and the players. In 2006, the commissioner called me and expressing concern over the widespread reports of the use of steroids in baseball and asked me to conduct an inquiry and to make recommendations for improvement in dealing with the issue. It was very difficult because the players at the time were unanimous, virtually unanimous, in their opposition to the investigation and to my participation. And of course, I used to be a U.S. attorney and a federal judge, so I'm familiar with the immense advantage that having the power of subpoena can create in any inquiry. I had no power to compel anybody to testify or to provide documents, so it was quite difficult. It took nearly 2 years. But eventually we were able to get enough information to produce a report that has largely been accepted and has resulted in Major League Baseball having the strongest drug control and testing program in any professional sport. I think you have to step back and view it in perspective. This is a social problem that has existed from the dawn of civilization and will continue. People cheating to gain an advantage. And it's a mistake to think that any program can simply end it completely. It's sort of like crime. Each of the 50 states has laws against crime, burglary, robbery, rape, murder. Nobody expects that all of those are going to end because of the passage of laws. So it's a problem of managing an ongoing social problem. And I think they've done that. I will say the one consequence that I'm most proud of is that when I conducted the investigation, the players were virtually unanimous in their opposition. They refused to participate. With one exception, they refused to talk to me. I made the argument to them. I contacted by letter every Major League Baseball player. And I said to them, a minority of players cheat. And the principal victims of their cheating are the majority who do not cheat. Because they are faced with the awful decision they should not have to make between competing at a disadvantage or cheating themselves. Yeah. And they rejected my argument. Today, 10 years later, the players have made a complete reversal. They have accepted that argument. They now advocate it themselves in dealing with this issue. And so I think a whole mindset has been changed by the nature of the report, the consequences, the actions taken, and it's a much healthier situation now.
Thank you, and this ends our session. Thank you very much, Senator Mitchell.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it.